Hello and welcome. I am very excited to have with me here today Kevin Gallagher, who's a professor of global development policy and the director of the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, and Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, who is the director of the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department at the IMF. Today, we're going to be talking about the IMF's recent issuance of $650 billion in special drawing rights. This was a historic amount. And we're going to be looking at different ways that these reserve assets can best be utilized. Right now, it's the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are a lot of financing needs, but there's also longer-term issues such as climate financing. So we're going to be looking at all of those. And I want to thank both of you for being here today. Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
Great. So maybe I can just start with you, Ceyla, and sort of get a little bit of, in brief, sort of the size and the scope of what this Sdr issuance is, and what you think it means for countries who are struggling right now in the middle of the pandemic.
Thanks for that, Shabtai, and it's very good to be on this panel with you and Kevin. Sdrs, special drawing rights, are international reserve assets. It was created in 1969 and serves as the unit of account of the IMF. Just a bit of background, as everyone is not necessarily familiar with it. It's not a currency nor a claim on the IMF. It's basically a potential claim on the freely usable currencies of IMF members. So member countries that receive the Sdrs can hold them as part of their official reserves or use them by converting into one of the 5 currencies that are in the Sdr basket: the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, and Japanese yen, and the British pound. So as you mentioned, the Sdr allocation this time around has been historic. It's unprecedented amount. In 2009, during the global financial crisis, the IMF Board of Governors approved an Sdr allocation amounting to about 250 billion US dollars of Sdrs. And on August 23rd, we had 650 billion US dollars of Sdrs that became effective. And this is critical because we are at a time when we have growing divergence between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies due to differences in vaccine access and ability to provide policy support.
And maybe I'll shoot it over to Kevin and ask you, what are some of the needs that you've been witnessing, some of the development challenges that have been emerging pre-pandemic and over the course of the pandemic, and where do you sort of see the Sdrs fitting in as a solution here?
Yeah, well, the Sdr issuance was probably the single greatest act of multilateralism in the middle of this crisis, which is otherwise the multilateral effort has been bleak, if you will measure it relative to vaccinating the world and so forth. And so it was a major move by the IMF and its membership. Why? Well, there's lots of short-term needs immediate right now in terms of liquidity for countries to be able to deal with their external debt burdens. But then there's a host of longer things, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and our Paris climate commitments. The IMF and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development estimated that emerging market and developing countries needed around $2.5 trillion in liquidity over the next year or two to be able to meet their foreign commitments. In the industrialized world, we printed about $17 trillion worth of liquidity through our central banks and so forth, but many emerging market and developing countries don't have access to those kinds of swaps and so forth. Their choices were to go to the International Monetary Fund for a sort of traditional program. Countries are reluctant to do that because of its conditionalities. 85 or so did go to the IMF for many of its short-term instruments, but only to about $100 billion. Otherwise, they had to go to the markets, which are relatively expensive in emerging market and developing countries, could be 8-9% for an African country. So first and foremost, these things were designed to be supplements to reserve assets. And by having special drawing rights on your balance sheet, you can either convert them to hard currency or you can keep them there and feel better about the dollar or the euro that you have in your balance sheet, and then you'll be able to spend that to be able to meet some of your external needs. But on top of that, we have new crises. These pandemics, climate change are external shocks that have nothing to do with the fundamentals of a country's policy frameworks that can cause major shocks to your balance of payments and your financial system. So countries need this kind of liquidity to be able to adapt to pandemics and climate change over time. And finally, we need about 2% of GDP extra per year in between now and 2030 to get on the right track to make the transitions we need to meet our climate change and our development goals. So immediately, we need liquidity support to make sure that we don't have crazy debt burdens and can move through this crisis. So countries have the fiscal space to be able to attack the virus and mount a green recovery. But maybe we're experimenting with something here that could help us with the longer term.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful to understand some of the issues. I know the World Bank has been warning about rising debt levels, and that really is a big concern. The IMF is warning about this divergent recovery between the advanced economies and a lot of other countries, many other countries. One of the issues that emerged with the Sdr allocation is that most of the Sdrs went to the wealthiest countries who have the largest share quota in the IMF. And now there are different ideas that have been moving pretty quickly on how to possibly rechannel Sdrs from the wealthiest countries to other countries through different mechanisms. So, Ceyla, maybe you can update us a little bit as to what's going on with those talks and where things are going.
Yes, sure. And it's a good time because we are just out of the annual meetings and there was a lot of discussion on the Sdrs and voluntary channeling of the Sdrs, very broad support from the membership. And as mentioned, the Sdr allocation, about $275 billion went to emerging market and developing economies. And this is a substantial boost to their reserves and credit worthiness. So I think that's one important aspect of the Sdr allocation. We sometimes forget that even if they are held in reserves, they are very much supporting emerging market countries, in particular, those that are highly indebted or fiscally constrained, by boosting their reserves. For low-income countries, they received about $21 billion. It's not a small amount. It's much bigger than the temporary liquidity support that was provided by the G20 debt service initiative. And since the allocation came into effect on August 23rd, members exchanged already about 6.5 billion Sdrs for currencies. And we have been engaging very closely with the authorities in terms of transparent and prudent use of Sdrs. Most have or are planning to use it on fiscal expenditures for priority spending like vaccine purchases, vaccine production capacity, urgent health needs, or more generally fiscal space to deal with this pandemic. And some are actually using the allocation to build external buffers and to repay expensive debt or lower the servicing cost of debt. I want to stress one thing before I go to the discussion on Sdr channeling, and that's the Sdr allocation is very useful and important mechanism at this time to build confidence and strengthen global economic and financial resilience, but it's not a silver bullet. It's really a part of a broader range of policy measures that IMF has deployed, other MDBs and bilateral donors in terms of loans, emergency facilities, and potential channeling of Sdrs are actually important in that context because that's another way of supporting countries in this very difficult time when we see very big divergences between advanced economies and emerging market countries and developing economies. So we have been talking about 3 options for Sdr channeling, and that's voluntary from members with strong external position to three different ways of channeling these SDRs. One is basically through our scaling up our poverty reduction and growth trust, the PRGT. We reformed the PRGT in the summer, in July, and there has been very strong support. It's in our IMFC communique, G20 communique, that members have really already agreed to scale up the poverty reduction and growth trust in a very substantial manner. So that's very important for the low-income countries in particular. And the second is what Kevin was also mentioning, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is to help countries address longer-term structural challenges and support the recovery from the pandemic towards a much more resilient, greener, and more equal progress going forward. The third option is channeling SDRs to multilateral development banks. This is still under discussion. It's complex, and I think this will be part of our work going forward as we work on these options.
Great, thanks for explaining those options. And it's definitely worth noting that these are very complex, multilateral discussions involving numerous institutions and all sorts of countries. So it can be quite difficult, but the G20 just gave the go-ahead and its approval for the new trust. So that seems to be a step towards getting things going. And one of the ideas is that that would sort of be a longer-term issue, that or longer-term fund that would help countries not only right now dealing with the pandemic, but also other issues like climate change. And I was wondering, Kevin, maybe you can say a little bit on that, what you would like to see, because they're still designing it. So what would you like to see come about through this trust once the IMF is able to get it rolling?
Sure. Well, first, let me underscore what Ceyla said, that SDRs are not a panacea for this current crisis. They really need to be part of a package of things. We need Sdr allocations for liquidity. We need lots of new development finance, especially concessional development finance and grants. And we need debt relief for a number of countries. And the RST and the rechanneling of special drawing rights can play a role in all three of those. I'm a member of something called the Task Force on Climate Development in the International Monetary Fund, and we put out a paper about what an RST could look like. It could really help countries that are climate vulnerable, not discriminating about their income level like other IMF programs do, but for climate vulnerable countries to be able to get short-term liquidity for climate shocks. So say there is a big drought in Kenya that hurts an export crop and hurts their balance of payment, or a hurricane in the Dominican Republic that wipes out their manufacturing and their ports and their hotels, that makes it difficult for services exports and hurts their balance of payments. So the countries like that can go to a window for balance of payment support in the short term. But also in the longer term, there are macro critical aspects of transitioning away from fossil fuels. So say South Africa transitions away from coal, or Indonesia does, they rely on coal exports for their balance of payments, and making that transition could have macro critical impacts for them. And so having access to a window like an RST for that kind of financing would address a big gap in the climate finance architecture. The key, however, is to make sure that these instruments are used. Over this crisis, there's been a number of innovative instruments that unfortunately haven't been attractive enough to the countries that are demanding them. There was an instrument called the short-term liquidity line that was set up because developing countries were saying, hey, look at all these swaps. We should get swaps too. What it came down to was just a short liquidity line. Countries haven't been so excited about it. The DSSI and especially the Common Framework are instruments that haven't gotten the demand that folks had hoped for. We really have to make sure that an RST, or a Resilience and Sustainability Trust, doesn't have a lot of onerous conditionalities, or countries just won't go to them unless they're absolutely desperate. We need an RST to be set up and be used. It's being discussed now of having somewhere between 30 and $50 billion for starters, that's a great way to pilot such a project. But we can't lock up that kind of money in climate finance. There's too huge of a need here. But
one of the interesting things that you mentioned there is this concessionality as well as the conditionalities. And one of the interesting things about the SDRs was that they basically came without any conditions. The countries that received them, as both of you mentioned, are able to use them freely, whether as reserves or otherwise. You know, that there are issues about conditionalities. So what is the best way that you think to make this easiest on countries so that they're able to both go and get it so that the money's used, but also so that there's not a burden on them when they go to the fund to take the money?
Sure. Well, like you said, the initial SDR allocation, each country gets the SDRs. They can do with them what they want. But we are in this rechanneling effort. Countries will be voluntarily rechanneling or on-lending those SDRs to the fund. And the idea is that they'll create a trust. So this money has to be paid back. So it's harder to just pass it on to the recipients. What our task force has argued is, like the PRGT, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, that the fund be used to provide subsidized or concessional financing, so still loans to countries in need, but at a cheaper rate because of these external shocks like pandemics and climate change that are on there, and that they be modeled off of programs at the IMF like the flexible credit line, so that don't have the kinds of conditionalities, because they recognize that there are countries that aren't going to have significant problems with the fundamentals of their own macroeconomic policy framework, but that external shocks like pandemics and climate change are things beyond their control, and therefore shouldn't be held up to the same kind of conditionality of a country that's gone very profligate with their fiscal spending or something like that.
I was wondering if I could maybe sort of ask the question over to you, but phrase it with regards to the middle income countries. We know that there's this growing climate financing need, and that, as Kevin touched on earlier, middle income countries are also likely going to need fiscal support as they try to adapt to climate change. Do you think that the IMF will be able to support that? I know that the IMF is centering climate change in part of its programs, but do you think these SDRs and the trust will be able to help the middle income countries as well adapt to climate change?
So we are actually discussing this issue with our executive board, and of course they will at the end have to agree on the particulars of how exactly this trust would work. Yes, there was a very loud call for including middle-income countries. So that's part of the eligibility framework that we have been working on. As I said, this will depend on the final approval of the board, but there is strong support, as you have seen in the various communiques as well, on including and making sure that the middle-income countries, which are very much subject to some of these important structural transformations, the impact of climate change and so on, are also included in the RSD. On conditionality, I think it's very important to have tailored and well-structured conditionality. This has been what the IMF has been doing in the last 10 years, especially after the review of our conditionality for the RST too. I mean, don't forget that these are donor countries with strong external positions who are providing their SDRs. The SDR has to preserve, the trust has to preserve the reserve asset status of these SDRs. Many countries are bound by legal, national, domestic, other rules that have put some limitations on them, and therefore it's going to be very important that we think through the credit risk, the financial structure of the trust, so that these countries that do have strong external positions can provide SDRs to the RST and keep them as reserve under reserve asset status. And for that, I think it's going to be very important to have policy safeguards to make sure that these go to countries that are in need, including middle-income countries, potentially concessional to those that are lower income. But don't forget, SDR rate is already very low. compared to what countries can get in the market. So for 20 years, getting these loans are going to be much more favorable in terms of access. But of course, we are also looking at whether we could provide concessional to some members which are low income and most vulnerable. So I think it's important to think of the quote unquote conditionality as very much aligned to the strategy that these countries are putting in place, and make sure that they have ownership. So if it's climate related reforms, that would be part of the RST lending, and that would support countries, especially very strongly if they have ownership of those policies that they want to implement.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really a good place to leave it, because it shows that there's going to be a need to both design the trust and then design the programs that afford the different countries as they receive them. But it does seem like things are moving ahead, and I guess that's some good news. And I'm sure there'll be more to discuss on this issue. We discussed it a lot at Devex. We have a newswire, we have a newsletter invested that deals with these issues every week. So there'll be more to come on this. I want to thank both of you, Kevin and Ceyla, for joining us. This was a really interesting discussion. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.